Welcome to Artmaking, a Latinx art and culture podcast. I'm your host, Mauricio Ramirez. In today's episode, I chat with Dr. Tatiana Reinoza, an art historian whose research and writing focus on contemporary Latinx art. She is an assistant professor in art history at the University of Notre Dame and has most recently published a solo-authored book titled Reclaiming the Americas, Latinx Art and the Politics of Territory, published by the University of Texas Press.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mauricio. It's so nice to see you again and to get a chance to talk about what we do in Latinx art. I am currently teaching. It's the spring semester at Notre Dame, and I am doing a class on Borderlands Art and Theory, which is a really fun seminar. And then I'm also teaching my new class in Latin American photography, where I spend the first half on Latin America and the second half on Latinx photography.
All right. Well, thank you for being here. So I want to start with origin story, how you became interested in visual art. And so my question is very specific. If you can recall a moment from your childhood or your youth when you first felt captivated by visual art.
That's such a good question. I also love origin stories. So for me, it's funny. I feel like I was being tracked for science when I was in school. Both of my parents came out of the medical field. My mom was a physical therapist and my dad was an MD. Both of them went to the Universidad Nacional in El Salvador. And so science kind of made sense to me for that matter. And I thought that I would be like an engineer or a computer scientist or something of that nature. And then when I was in my senior year, I was actually required to take an art class otherwise I would not graduate. And I ended up taking a ceramics class like at 7 a.m, which was brutal for a high school kid. And I just fell in love with it. It was the most fun thing I had ever done. And I remember telling my teacher, Mr. Charles, that I wanted more of this in my life. And he suggested that I apply to this thing called the California State Summer School for the Arts. I don't know if this is still around, but it was a program that would take high school students, and for 4 weeks, we could spend that time at the Cal Arts campus, make art during the day, watch films at night, see performances. They would take us around to see local museums in LA. And so that experience really opened up a whole new world for me. It was the first time I saw like Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera's work, some of the really amazing artists that you know from the LACMA collection, right? Mm-hmm. I remember the Burn Baby Burn piece, like I just saw it. I feel like that completely changed my trajectory. And even though I had this idea that I was going to go to school and do engineering or science, that completely changed my course. And I ended up in art studio. And I was very lucky that I was admitted to Cal State Sacramento. That's my hometown where I grew up. And there were Chicano professors in the department. Ricardo Favela was one of them. And he got me involved with the Barrio Arts program that he was running, which, got me to work at La Raza Galeria Posada, an organization that the Royal Chicano Air Force had started early in the 1970s. As a bookstore and a gallery space for artists. And with Favela, I was able to take silkscreen classes and learn about the poster movement that they had been a part of in support of the United Farm Workers. So that really set the stage for me. It was such a formative experience. And sometimes I tell my students, like, really, the grades you get in college don't matter. It's about finding what you're really passionate about and what you're committed to. And I feel like that was like a critical time for me.
Yeah, it's really a moment of self-discovery. It's just a moment to explore. I want to backtrack. Was this program, or when you were attending high school, was this in LA? You mentioned LA, but then you also mentioned Sacramento is your hometown. So I was curious.
Yeah, I did high school in Sacramento, in South Sacramento. I graduated from Florin High. And this program was something that high school kids from all over the state could apply to. And then you would be, if you were admitted, you could go down to the Cal Arts campus and stay there for 4 weeks and do the program.
Okay. So that was just one summer.
That was just one summer, but that changed everything.
Right. What grade was that? Was it in between?
Right after I finished high school.
Oh, right after. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I gave up an internship with Hewlett Packard to go do this summer school.
Oh, wow. And that internship with Hewlett Packard, was it based on, what was it focused on?
It would have probably been more along the lines of computer science engineering, just getting me exposed to some of what they do.
So right before the summer before college, it's like you completely change your perspective.
Yeah.
And maybe career trajectory, obviously now, because you're an assistant professor in art history.
Exactly.
So then when you're in college, what medium were you gravitated towards? Were you, into painting or drawing or, so many different mediums? Was posters sort of the one that you gravitated to the most?
So I did a couple of courses with Favela in the Silkscreen Lab, and I definitely gravitated toward that. I felt like there was something very immediate to it, but also the medium had a community component built in, because when you make multiples, like, you can give them to your friends, you can trade, like, automatically there's a sense of community that comes with it. I also had friends who would play in bands at the time, and get to make things for them, merchandise or T-shirts. That seemed like also a really fun way to apply this art. I also really enjoyed painting. I think that there's something very, like, rewarding about doing that kind of work, and I felt like for me that was a time where I just got to experiment and try new things. I also worked with someone like Kathy Stone, and she taught sculpture and collage, and the things that I enjoyed the most are the studio critiques, where you get to talk about these things with your classmates and ask questions. And eventually I realized I started to get more drawn into art history. I did a lot of coursework with Elaine O'Brien, and she kind of exposed me to research methods. And I remember her teaching a Latin American art class at my urging, because I was like, there's got to be more to this. And I feel like that really allowed me to grow in terms of my thinking. Like, writing became a way of thinking. And so as I was getting closer to the end of my program, I realized, I really want to do art history, but we didn't have a program. So I just went ahead and finished my major in studio.
And so was it soon after that you apply to art history programs for master's, I believe, or did you go straight to a PhD?
No, I actually took a couple of years off, and in the process, I ended up moving to Austin. And I remember wanting to like establish residency there before I applied to school. And I think it was in 2006 that I applied, in 2007 that I was admitted to the master's program there. And I was very lucky that just around that time, Jacqueline Barnett's was retiring. I remember being able to take one of her last graduate seminars at UT, and she's an icon in the field. She was a pioneer in Latin American art. And then soon after, Roberto Tejada and Andrea Junta were hired, and they became like really important, mentors and professors for me, especially Tejada, who I did my master's thesis work under.
So did you have the idea of going to a PhD, or did you start as a master's and then it was like PhD, or did you do the master's sort of en route to the PhD?
Yeah, I felt like the options were limited to just stay at the MA level, and by then I had really fallen in love with research and writing and just this like academic life of having an intellectual life, having opportunities to sit in seminars with people, critique work, learn from it, and I decided I wanted to stay for the PhD. UT has a policy where you have to reapply. I believe I took a year off, and then I went back for the PhD I think in 2010. And at that point, I started working with Dr. Cherie Smith as my advisor. She is more of a performance art historian and a scholar of African American art history. But she was so incredibly supportive of students of color in the program, and was really like an amazing advocate for me in art history.
Excellent. So thinking about, okay, you finished your PhD, you're now a professor at Notre Dame in art history. And I know there's sort of an in-between moment where you did a postdoc, right? I'm curious how that postdoc informs the book, and we can discuss the book, your new book, Reclaiming the Americas, Latinx Art and the Politics of Territory. And that's also published by the University of Texas Press. And so I was curious how that book came about. Was it influenced by your dissertation? I know a lot of academics, their first book is often inspired by their first, or by their dissertation. Or was it inspired by some other project, post graduating with the PhD? If you could discuss the inspiration behind your book, Reclaiming the Americas.
Yeah. So my dissertation is titled Latino Print Cultures in the U.S. And in that project, I was very interested in researching how printmaking had contributed to this idea of Latinidad, this shared collective identity. And I found some really amazing case studies in which Chicano artists had done portraits of Puerto Rican icons like Lolita Lebron. I found cases where Ecuadorian American artists had made posters about undocumented migrants in Texas and what that meant to them, right? And so I felt like while that was really important as a standalone project, and I could have probably published it as it was, I found that things shifted for me in 2016. I graduated with my PhD. I got a Society Fellows postdoc at Dartmouth College, and then we had an election, right? And the political climate of this country changed so drastically that year. I remember when the Muslim ban went into effect, and the kind of xenophobic nativist rhetoric that that president brought out was so extreme that it felt to me like the questions I was asking were not relevant for that specific moment. And so I was lucky that the postdoc gave me like 3 years to rethink and expand the project and then think more broadly about printmaking as a tool for colonization, but also as a tool for taking that power back and creating self-representational narratives for these communities. So it was really within that political moment that I kind of reformulate these questions and start looking at other case studies.
Yeah, and it becomes much more relevant in thinking about. I mean, I think in reading your book, when you think about colonization, thinking about maps, what was the inspiration behind using maps? There's sort of a thread with maps throughout, several chapters. And so thinking about how artists deal with, sort of also in their own work, right, decolonizing and reclaiming images or icons or remixing icons to make a political statement or a statement, right? That's political in a sense, but also in many ways it's going against what's been established, right, by the norm, and a lot of this goes way back to times of colonization, right, like 1492. So yeah, if you could discuss that, the discussion around maps, and then also a discussion around decolonization.
Those are great points. So the question of maps is an interesting one. It didn't begin there for me. It began more with territorial representations, whether it was a city or some way of demarcating land. And I began to notice that in the work. I also noticed that this idea of reclaiming the land was something that was very old in our field in terms of Chicano art history. These concepts of Aztlán, right, that go back to the history of the Aztecs and their origin stories, and there's also this idea of Latinx artists being part of these diasporas, right, and really struggling with belonging in this country, but having this desire to want to claim space here and to want to feel part of this. And so that's kind of where some of my ideas began, and then I started to see that some of that had kind of gone further into map making. And one of the things that I found fascinating in the work of Sandra Fernandez, for example, is that there was a desire to want to see how the medium itself, the medium of printmaking, had been involved in all of these projects, right? The way we think about map making, the way that lands were distributed during colonial times, like all of it revolved around this new technology that Europe had with prints. And prints were like integral to every part of the colonization process, like from distributing like notions of like new uncharted land that they were discovering or claiming, to elements of religion, right, that were spread through this process as well, in terms of converting the indigenous populations. So I noticed that for certain artists like Enrique Chagoya and Alberto Rios, whom I talk about in the book, that had also been to think about map making had also been like a very creative exercise where you could combine images and poetry and rethink what maps could do. And they, like some of their work in the You Are Here portfolio that they did at Segura Publishing in Arizona in 2000, kind of upends how we think about the global north and the global south being positioned, right? Or even the technical precision with which maps are made, and sort of upends all of these things to get you to think in a kind of disobedient way of, is there another way to think about this? Because what ends up happening is that these things become normative, like you said, in a certain way when Europe rises as a colonial power and Eurocentrism expands worldwide. And it takes a lot of work to undo some of what's left in terms of that epistemology, right? So to create new ways of thinking, you really have to experiment like these artists are doing.
And how much did you have to dig deep in terms of archives? I was just curious. I mean, there's a lot of images, and you have to go way back. And some of these images and artists are fundamental to sort of art history, at least what I've seen in the book and what you reference. But was there a lot of archival research involved in for writing this book?
There was a lot of archival work involved, but some of it is maybe not as traditional as we might think. A lot of Latinx art has not yet been institutionalized to the extent
Right.
that other art canons have. And so some of it involved me going to actual printmaking workshops and asking, can I look through your flat files, right? Can I help you inventory this list so that I can have access to some of this information? I remember spending several days at the Mission Cultural Center in San Francisco when La Raza Graphics Center still had a collection there. And I was just allowed into this little room, and to spend as much time as I wanted to go through their collection, and to research, take pictures, try to make sense of what had been left. And now that collection, luckily, is part of the California Ethnic Multicultural Archive at Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara. But that's not the case for all of these printmaking workshops or printmaking collectives around the country, of which my book tracks. Like there's been dozens, right? I feel like the history I'm telling is such a small part of a very large movement.
Were you able to work with artists individually or maybe go into their archives?
Yeah, in some cases I was. For example, the artist Ricardo Duffy, who I write about in chapter 1, was incredibly generous in allowing me to do studio visits at his home in he had 2 homes at the time, one in Laguna Beach, and the other, I'm going to forget the name of that town, but there's a mission at the center. It might be San Juan Bautista. And with him, there was an opportunity to visit multiple times, to go through files together, to look at artwork together. And one of the things I really love is building a relationship with these artists, right? I mean, they are trusting me with their artwork and with their life stories at times, and I think it's such a privilege that I get to share that time with them. And I also want them to know, like, what a responsibility it feels like for me to do a good job, right, of telling their stories.
Right. Yeah. And that's going back to the point where you're saying, Latinx artists are just not in the archives. We're not written about, I think, enough as well. So you're kind of at the forefront of building this archive, this knowledge. interviewing and working with artists. So I commend you for that work, because it's definitely in the process of, growing and expanding. But it does take often, academics, researchers, journalists, right, to get this information out there. But also it's a very personal sort of, being invited into someone's house, right? But that's what it takes, right, to get some of, this knowledge, because it's just not readily available.
Yeah, and so I think it takes a reevaluation of what oral history can contribute, right? If you have been left out of the archive, the institutional
Right.
archives, like oral history takes on a different meaning. And then the idea that there are alternative ways of thinking about an archive, and that some of them are community centered or community controlled, right? But I want to acknowledge that there are so many scholars before me who have been building this field and building these archives at an institutional level, like Chon Noriega, Karen Mary Davalos. There are so many who have really created places like the Chicano Studies Research Center, who have shared their interviews, oral history interviews. I mean, that's really like how we build a field. Nobody can do it on their own. Like, it really has to be a group effort. And a lot has changed in the last 10 to 15 years. We've seen the mainstream institutions like Smithsonian American Art, the National Gallery, kind of open up to having the voices of Latinx artists reflected in their collections. And I was also thinking of the work Josh Franco is doing at the Archives of American Art, the important initiative he began there, which is now at least probably a decade old, and has really changed the face of that collection.
Yeah. So it's important. I mean, what I'm taking away from that is how important institutions are in terms of collecting, or collecting interviews, data, archives around Latinx artists. And it's very much true, because I remember when I started my PhD program, which is around 2015, it felt like a lot of things were in motion, and they were just sort of happening at that moment. So to see institutions and yeah, I guess institutions in general, as much as institutions can sometimes work against us, I think there has been a big push, right? And research centers opening up at universities. I also think that's really important. I think about the Latinx Project, NYU, and a whole lot, and there's the historic, right, Latinx or research centers, and a lot of name changing has happened as well, right? Because times are changing. So I've noticed a lot of places that were maybe Chicano research centers have now changed to Latinx, or
Or including Central American voices as well.
You're referring to UCLA?
Yeah, UCLA in particular. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so times are changing as well, right? Like the Latinx demographic is it's not so. I want to be respectful, but there's this historical background of why these names even emerge, right? And a lot of them were civil rights movements sort of era. But then we also see the Latinx demographic is so diverse here in the United States, 20, 30, 40 years later from these names and institutions being founded, that, the names have changed. And sometimes I know that sort of hurts folks to have a name change, but it's also, part of, I just want to say, evolution as well, right? Like, we're in different times and different eras, and that requires often language also changing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So moving forward, I want to talk about your other book. That's also, I mean, it came out. Did it come out at the same time? Was it like, it was very close in terms of
within a week.
Oh, wow. I didn't know it was that close.
Yeah.
So your second book, it's a co-edited book with Dr. Karen Mary Davalos. And the book is called Self-Help Graphics at 50, a cornerstone of Latinx art and collaborative art making.
Yeah, so what really inspired this book on self-help graphics at 50 is that there was a huge anniversary coming up for the organization. And I still remember the day when I was sitting at my Dartmouth office in 2017, and I got this call from Karen Mary Davalos, asking me if I would be interested in working on this project with her, and really saying, like, I want to work as peers. I want us to co-edit this project. She said, I have like a wealth of experience in terms of researching Chicano art in LA, especially from the oral history perspective, right? Like she's an amazing ethnographer. And she said, and you have the specialization in printmaking. And I think that would be a perfect combination for us to do a really interesting project to delve into this archive further, because what existed at the time was a finding aid that the Chicano Studies Research Center had published, along with an essay by a historian. And she felt that really nobody had looked at the art very closely, that there was so much more work that needed to be done. And I was starting to like reformulate my dissertation into my book. So I thought, oh my God, this is going to be so much work. But I was excited about it, and I knew I wanted to delve into that archive. That was something that had been asked of me at my dissertation defense. Why not look at self-help? That's the cornerstone of this movement, and it really, really is. And so it was a great opportunity. So I jumped at it, and we began with a call for papers, which I think half the contributors came from that. And then as we started to lay out a map for what the book would look like, we felt that there were specific scholars doing certain work in the field that could fill particular niches we wanted. Like, for example, Kenzie Cornejo, who works on Central American diaspora artists. We wanted somebody to cover that moment in the 1980s when self-help became a haven for Central American artists who were fleeing from war or civil strife. And she wrote a beautiful essay. So it was a perfect match for that. We also wanted to really highlight the queer histories of this space. In particular, because two of the founders, right, are an artistic, romantic couple. And that really wasn't talked about for a very long time. There was this kind of shroud of heteronormativity, and we wanted to just do away with that and talk more openly and inclusively about LGBTQ art histories there. And so Rob Hernandez was a perfect contributor for us to tap and say, hey, would you like to work on the Homo Hombre LA portfolio? And again, another beautiful essay came out of that. So the project took 5 years. And for an edited anthology, that's actually a pretty good timeline. I feel like we worked very well together, and we all knew, like, we need to put this thing together within 2 to 3 years because it'll take 2 years to go to press. And we have to make the deadline because the 50th anniversary was just around the corner. So I'm really proud that it came out in April 2023, and I think that it will have a huge impact in telling the story of self-help from all of these different perspectives, right? Because for a lot of people, like self-help is only Sister Karen, Bocalero, the Franciscan nun, and for others, it's only a Chicano art community space, but it's so much more than that. And so we really wanted the contributors to really highlight all of these different aspects of it.
Yeah, congratulations yeah, I've been reading it, and I like the varied perspectives, and that's also telling of how time has changed, right? Like, I think a lot of organizations come from the 70s, from, sort of inspired by Chicano civil rights movements, because I'm thinking a lot of some of the institutions that also appeared here in San Francisco. Um, but how each institution has its own sort of inspiration for future generations because they're still there, right? Like these institutions are still here and they were created with a purpose, but we don't know how that reverberates in the future. And you've been able to capture how artists have contributed to self-help graphics, but have also, grown from that and have become their own artists. And they're also part of this larger entity of U.S. Latinx art.
And even more broadly than that, sometimes Chicano and Chicanx, Latinx art institutions are thought of as being very insular and only serving a particular local community. And one of the great things that came out of this volume is that JV de Semviral and Olga Herrera work on the international component, helping us think about how these artists were actually in conversation with the things that were happening in Mexico City with the grupos, for example, at the same time in the 1970s, or the fact that they are able to tour exhibitions. Olga Herrera has a fantastic essay on the way that the self-help graphics is touring exhibitions in Africa and Europe, and really kind of internationalizing the discourse around Chicano art, especially at a time when it's not recognized in the United States, right? And to be able to do that abroad really makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I've often thought about this too, of how posters circulate, right? They're so international. I've been to El Salvador, Chile, and I've seen posters created in San Francisco, or I guess originating from San Francisco, and they travel all the way to, different parts of the world. And so there's that element to posters as well that, to me, that's sort of what makes it fascinating too. It's mobile in a sense, not like a painting where it's on a canvas maybe and it's a little harder to distribute. But that to me has always been sort of the power behind posters, and they're ephemeral, but at the same time, how artists have remixed this media and made it really into an art form. It speaks to how, posters circulate. And to me, that's always been something exciting. What did you learn from creating maybe both books, if you want to sort of, now that they're out there in the world, what did you learn that changed your outlook on Latinx art?
Wow, that's a big question. I think that really with these two books, along with Printing the Revolution, that beautiful exhibition catalog that Carmen Ramos edited with the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Princeton, one of the things that I realized is that there's actually like a very strong desire to see more of this scholarship. And I think that for a long time, even areas like printmaking history, which is sometimes dismissed as craft work, right? Or maybe not as important in the hierarchy of mediums like painting and sculpture. It seems like it's finally getting its due, and that people are really hungry for it, and I feel like it's hopefully only a beginning, and that there's going to be a lot more work in this field. Like there are over 800 editions that have been pulled at Self-Help Graphics. Like there's so much, like we're so rich in terms of this history, and there's so much more work that needs to be done. So I hope that there's like a grad student out there that reads one of these books and says, I could do this better, and that we continue building the field that way. What else could I say about that? I'll also say that, like, the work we've done in terms of these publications does not ameliorate or alleviate the fact that so many of these artists are still in a position of precarity. Many of them do not have gallery representation. Many of them have to have 2 or 3 jobs to sustain themselves. And I hope that the scholarship does something to correct that. But I also think that more needs to be done on that institutional level to level the playing field for them. And I worry that the market simply hasn't caught up in terms of where we are. I don't know what else I could add to that.
Well, no, just to add on that, that's something that I was enlightened to in many respects through Arlene Davila's work on Latinx art, her book, which is titled Latinx Art. And I didn't know how much the market, influences artists themselves, right? Like collectors, we need collectors to collect Latinx art, and that market is not there. So then what you said, like what do artists, live on if this is their living, right, is through art. So it's also difficult to be an artist. And that's something, me as well, because I work with artists as well. And yeah, it's just at a sort of precarious state that in many respects, I think we're hopefully giving them representation through publications and documentation and whatnot. But that is another sort of reality of being an artist. And some have been, accomplished but then there's sort of there's sometimes up and coming, I think of myself, I'm putting myself in these shoes, is like when I wanted to be an artist as an undergrad, that was sort of a fear. And it might happen to a lot of sort of first generation artists across the board, maybe not just Latinx, but thinking about, how am I going to make money from this? Like you, I ended up just being really interested in the research and talking to artists and documenting them. And I felt like that was my contribution instead of being more of the creator. But no, that's something I contemplate with as well. I don't know if you have any words to say there.
That we, like you said, we need more collectors, we need more gallerists, we need more dealers, we need more art fairs. And Arlene Davila's book does an amazing job of really getting us to understand how the market is this field of power. And when you've been underrepresented in it for such a long time, it's really hard to create value for your work. And so while I'm incredibly happy to see that we're having this moment where these publications are now possible, where they're being taught at universities, and artists are getting that kind of scholarly recognition, I think that we can do a lot more in terms of creating a market for them. And I know some institutions like are trying and are trying to make those changes. But it seems like we could do more.
Yeah. It's slowly changing. I mean, it's exactly what you said, like, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago to have publications around Latinx art just might have not been taken seriously. But there's also more, and I think it's slowly creeping in different areas, right? Like there's more Latinx artists when I think about digital media that we're in, the social media, that's sort of a counter, you know, way to put your work out there instead of relying on galleries. I often think about this too. Even when I teach, I think about and telling students, it's like we don't need to rely on a gallery necessarily. There's social media, there's virality. So there's different ways to approach this. Not that that's like a one size fits all, right, solution, but just seeing this movement, of art, Latinx art, being slowly published, more in institutions. And also what you said, like institutions are giving more grants or funding more projects for Latinx artists and artists of color. So, times are changing, and I do, that gives me hope in terms of thinking about, the future and all the great academics and scholarship that's coming out, young scholars that are, working on this as well. I'm sure we both know, colleagues that are working on this, and those who are in PhD programs who are doing amazing work. Slowly but surely, I would hope to see, some of these folks in teaching and continuing to teach and continuing to create their research. So thank you for the work you've done. So I want to sort of talk about, what's cooking, like what's in the future. Are you working on new projects?
Yeah, so what's on the horizon? Currently, I am writing an essay for an exhibition that Tere Romo is curating at the Crocker Art Museum. It's going to be a major retrospective on the Royal Chicano Air Force, and it feels like a full circle moment for me to be able to go back and do this kind of work with artists that I knew when I was 18 or 19. And I'm writing about Luis Gonzalez, who is better known as Louis the Foot.
Yeah.
He's one of the most talented artists to come out of this collective. He was a junior Brown Beret in middle school who became a poet, and he found this group of Chicano artists while he was studying at Cal State Sacramento. And they taught him how to silkscreen, and he started making concrete poetry in the 1970s as a result. So I'm really focusing on that moment when he's producing these concrete poems, which I think are really significant in terms of Chicano art history and unusual in terms of the canon. So I'm really excited about that. And then in addition to that, I'm starting a new book project that's called Retorno, Art and Kinship in the Making of a Central American Diaspora. And that project, Retorno, is something that I have been cooking in the background for a very long time. I've been thinking about how the Central American diaspora artists go back to the Isthmus to do projects about their family. And I'm Central American. I was born in El Salvador, raised in the U.S., and my whole life has been this circular migration between here and the Isthmus, and that has to do with kinship, right? Like, we're always going back to see family. And some years of my schooling were here, some years were there. And part of it is my own autoethnographic kind of interest. But another part is seeing how Central Americans are kind of represented in the U.S. and how these artists are creating different narratives on self-representation, particularly using photography. So building on my work in printmaking, I'm thinking of another medium now that is also multiples, is also a reproductive medium, like photography, and thinking about how they're drawing these connections with their family. So that's an ongoing project that'll probably take me a few years, but I'm really excited about about it because it's giving me a chance to travel back and to learn more about Central American history, but also learn more about these migration patterns and how these artists ended up arriving here.
What you stated earlier was it's sort of thinking about your own biography, right? Your own trajectory of coming from El Salvador. And that's something we share, right? Like my parents are from El Salvador. I was born here in San Francisco, but there's always, I think, in the diaspora or folks that have, sort of that Central American heritage to think about returning. And now there's more accessibility or yeah, I would say for some, right? Obviously for others, you can't. And there's that wanting to return. So there's always a narrative around returning, right, to Central America.
There's such a longing to return, but for some people it's impossible, right? Like for folks from Nicaragua, what's happening there right now is so dangerous. I know a number of artists who are from Nicaragua and wish they could return, but it's not possible.
Well, I'm excited. It's also a different medium, right? So, and that's something I've admired about your work is that I know you're of Central American descent. And, my thought was, oh, you're a lot of your publications will be around Central America, but they haven't. They've taken a more expansive look at U.S. Latinx artists. Because of that, I think I've also sort of expanded my own research and thinking about, I don't have to just do Central American artist or art, although that's obviously something I lean towards, but thinking of the more expansive sort of, and thinking also how a lot of our histories are intersectional, right? And I think that's something that comes through with your work. And also just knowing you, right? Like, I think being sort of an interlocutor is the way I see it, sometimes academics as well, because we are also coming from these histories of diaspora, civil wars, imperialism being imposed on us. So, yeah, I just respect your work, and I'm excited to continue reading your research and seeing what new publications and research you're going to, publish in the future.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mauricio.
Thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. Is there a way in which the general public can reach you if you have a website or social media?
On Twitter or X, I'm at Tatiana Reinoza. And on Instagram, you can follow me at dr.reinoza.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, this concludes our interview with Dr. Tatiana Reinoza. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.